So, I was actually really pleased with the amount of responses I got to my request for viewers' suggestions for topics. And they've all been very interesting. And honestly, I've taken more than a couple to go and have a look at. But I decided to do this one because, well, Knight6831 kind of loaded the base in his favour by putting in about 24 different topics suggested. And more importantly, it was an interesting topic to have. But what I am going to say is, from now on, as I've always done, is that sort of viewer suggestions, they come up throughout the year. They're always scheduled for every month, which has 5 Tuesdays in it. The 5th Tuesday is a viewer's suggestion. So basically, if anyone has suggestions or topics they'd like to see covered in that year's rough theme, roughly within that theme, because remember, this is naval history broadly conceived as the theme of this channel, then please put them in the comments. But always remember to put viewer suggestion in the comment, so that when I do a nice quick search for it, I find the ones which are suggestions for it. Because there were a couple of people who I hadn't really said that beforehand, so I thought, well, I'll go and try and dig around for them. And the amount of people who had these wonderful long comments discussing the whole video, etc., very long, and then about at the bottom, a one-line viewer suggestion topic, and it was a case of, that's quite a. I have to do a lot of work to make sure I don't miss those, and I don't want to miss them. So if they have viewer suggestion written in them, when I do a search, they'll all come up. So now that bit of channel admin, for want of a better phrase, is out the way, when does the Navy know it's time to replace a type or class of ships? And, well, there's going to be 2 videos on this. There's going to be the video tonight, which is going to be sort of Form 1 presentation. And there's going to be a discussion video, which is going to come out tomorrow, when I'm going to be building that. That's going to be recorded later today, or rather later this evening, because, broadly speaking, this is a video which could either be done in very quickly, and this one is going to be quite quick, or it can be done very long and very discursive. And some people like it one way, some people like it the other way, and I thought, honestly, I can do it both. I honestly can. I can keep the slides up going, and I can put a sort of little video, another sort of video source on the screen, and just go through that and go, this is what's happening. So that's what I'll do. When does the Navy know it is time to replace a type or class of ships? Well, there is the obvious one, age. Ships have a design life. But the thing is, as we all know, those things are sort of pushed. In fact, these days they're often pushed a lot, as nations can't make their minds up what to replace their existing equipment with. So instead, because they can't decide on what the perfect solution is, they keep refitting old stuff and hoping to keep it going. Sometimes that's because they've honestly lost the capability to build new equipment. Something which sounds strange to say, but it is a true and serious scenario. If we consider modern Russia. Okay, it's a very capable nation in many ways in its production and capabilities. I'm not going to pretend it's not. It's got also issues, but everyone has their own issues. But the big thing is, the reason the Kuznetsov is still around, the reason they are constantly refurbishing the Kirovs, the reason most of their large surface combatants, I'm not talking about their frigates, I'm talking about things bigger than a frigate, are constantly refurbished, reconditioned. Oh my lord, is it still afloat? Vessels from the Soviet Union era is because, honestly, their yards have lost the capacity in terms of the infrastructure, the depth of resources and support to actually build bigger ships. There is a reason why there is a constant flow of wonderful designs, really interesting, intriguing designs coming out of Russia for their future ships, including nuclear-powered destroyers and all sorts of things. And they'll never get built. They are building icebreakers, they are building submarines, because they've kept those competencies alive. But to build a new generation of large surface vessels, aircraft carriers, cruisers, whatever, well, they haven't actually done that work to keep that alive. And someone can turn around and go, well, you know, they build frigates. Surely they can just scale it up. You can't. If we consider the UK, one of the reasons the UK does the whole modular construction thing for its destroyers, its frigates, and its aircraft carriers and everything else is because, apart from it being a core competency which we've managed to maintain, it actually makes it in some ways an easier project for us to manage within the core competencies we've maintained in order to build large vessels. It means we don't have to depend on the infrastructure and resources of a single yard to be able to sustain a production effort and build an aircraft carrier or anything. Then one yard might be an assembly place, but we don't depend on it for everything. And Britain can do that because Britain has two main advantages. One, it's geographically not anywhere near as massive as sort of the Russia in comparison. And it's also an island, so you can float the things around it on a barge. But number two, it has a large population of skilled personnel in terms of design, in terms of engineering. That has been kept going for years. Now, whilst Peter Zine is probably the most famous person who talks about this in terms of Russia, the demographic issues they have in terms of their engineering competency, in terms of the number of engineers they have, staying within Russia, is kind of an open knowledge. It's an open thing that they have an incredibly good generation of older engineers and some very, very good, but very few of them, younger engineers coming through, and not enough bulk of them in between. So the thing is, Britain has enough to be able to handle the multiple projects. So that is a factor. Those are factors which all affect your construction, your replacement of ships, and when it's time for a class to retire. Because the other thing is, if you are using increasingly a smaller and smaller pool of highly skilled and highly capable but aging engineers to do a large amount of your work, and this is something which doesn't just affect Russia, it affects other countries as well. Sticking to designs that they've already worked on and worked out and modifying them makes life easier. It means you don't have to reinvent a lot of the things. You don't have to rework a lot of things. Shameless book plug. So, the factors, broadly speaking, are Wear and tear on components, hull life, upgradability, suitability, crew requirements. These are all factors in whether or not a class is replaced. There's also age. But that's hull life. That's wear and tear on components. Those factors are the factors about age. Because you can go, well, you know, this ship, we need to, its engines are worn out. We need to replace the engines. Okay. How's the hull life looking? And again, if I want to give an example, and I am going to be using Britain as an example of this, but that's mainly because, thanks to my dad and a large number of his friends, because my dad was a naval architect and mainly worked in the UK, but also did some work in the States, in the Far East, in various places, and thanks to that, I did get to meet a lot of naval architects from around the world. I think at one point, my mother, complained she was organising a dinner for a dozen naval architects, none of which came from the same country, and none of which had the same food cultural background. So she was hoping they'd like the menu she was cooking, because she was going, And that was a fact of life for me growing up. But it did mean I got exposed to a lot of these factors quite early on, and it made some of the history interesting when I was looking at what historians had said. The thing is, if you replace the engines and you don't fix any hull warping and hull issues, well, the new engines can actually end up tearing the hull apart thanks to the vibrations they'll cause. Quite a lot of modern engines are rafted for one of two reasons. Rafting means that you make sure they're not directly connected with the hull. Now, you can be rafting it for sound reasons, that's anti-submarine warfare, in which case you'll put a lot of compensators and systems in to reduce the sound, to stop vibrations going through the hull into the water, to stop the noise getting out of the engine room. But you also can do it, and you do it sometimes these days, because some engines, their actual throbbing, their vibrating, their movement, the constant movement of them, and they will want to move because the amount of force they're putting into, let's say, a shaft going out to drive a propeller, there is a force coming back from the sea, so they have to be securely positioned, but they're going to also, there's going to be movement there. It can put stresses on the hull, especially if you put a new engine into an older hull, because the older hull was designed for the old engines, not for the new engines. And this is nothing new. This is something we realised quite early on when we were fitting engines to ships. It was a big factor in the battleship upgrades in the 1930s, when they're putting in new engines in ships for Britain, for America, for Japan and Italy. A big factor was working out, hang on, okay, that hull was not designed for that engine. Let's work this through. Hull life. Hulls have a life. They have a life cycle. Now, in submarines, we're talking about how many dives they can take, and once it goes past a certain point, you really don't want to go down in that sub, because whilst it might be fine, it may well not. And that is often the reason why submarines have the hardest end of life cycle. In that, if you want to extend it, and extend a submarine's time in service, you have to do a lot of work on that hull. Especially on the pressure hull, you have to check it. You have to go over it, because if there are any faults developing on it, you're in trouble. And this is also a reason why sometimes you might see vessels which are late in class, for the previous class, lasting longer in service than the vessels which were first in class, or the class succeeding them. Why? Well, maybe the stresses they've been through have been different in terms of diving depths, but all operating requirements might have been different. But also there's the fact that when you're building designs for a first time, you're more likely to make little mistakes than you are when you've been going through it longer. And the rest of these, upgradability, suitability, crew requirements, these are all things which, how do I put this politely, are the justification for the cost of dealing with the first two. And if they are not the right figures, you can't win over the cost of the first two. So wear and tear on components. There is nothing more corrosive than steam. There really isn't. Some fuels are pretty corrosive. There's some fuels which are really, really bad for joints and all sorts of things. But steam is lethal. Steam can wipe out an entire engine room crew. It can also wear through an engine. This is where a lot of metallurgy comes in, and where often the idea of, well, let's put in new engines. Lovely. Have we designed anything into the system to allow those new engines to be fitted for starters? And already talked about rafting, but have we worked out why those engines are failing? Is it just old age? One of the interesting things I discussed with someone not long ago was about car engines versus ship engines. And they went, well, we take our car onto a racetrack. They're not part of McLaren, but they work with McLaren because they worked with one of the universities I used to work for's own Formula sort of racing team. It's not Formula 1, I think it's Formula 4 or 3, something like that. It's well down the numbers, but, Anyway, so they were talking about engines, and they were going, yeah, our engines, they wear out the fastest of any engines. I looked at them and went, you're probably right. And they immediately didn't like that one because I was saying probably. But I pointed out that whilst they wear out the fastest in terms of their use, if you consider compared to their expected use, and they are basically a track day vehicle which is used 3 or 4 times a week, etc., does a lot of heavy working out time, versus their length of life and their expected use, they're actually quite long lasting. If you consider ship engines, which could be going 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, they can be. It's quite possible for a ship engine to never be switched off. It should be for maintenance and repair, but it's quite possible. There are examples in World War II of vessels which were kept running to be able to go quickly in and quickly out, so it would keep an engine going, so that they would still have fuel being warm, they'd still have all the stuff, all sort of the boilers ready, the engine sort of ticking over but not turning the propeller, etc., and those sort of scenarios. And there is a sort of folklore story about at least a couple of destroyers in the Royal Navy in World War II, and a couple of American destroyers in World War II, which were doing this. And it wasn't until they went in for a later war service that someone picked up that, oh, every single time you've been in port, you've picked engine X as your continual running engine. Oh yes. Why? Well, we never had problems with that. We've never shut it down. Oh? And without realising it, that engine had literally been, from the moment they turned it on to the moment they started it, gone through the process on it, to the moment they had stopped it for the service, had been running. Sometimes in low levels, sometimes at high levels, sometimes at a constant pitch, because they were cruising. But it had never been shut down. If you consider those engines are supposed to survive for basically the life of the ship, i.e. 20, 30 years these days, and roughly the same period in the 1920s and 30s, you can understand why, when they were doing such things, and such things happened, that sometimes the engines need to be replaced, or rather, pretty much rebuilt, because often what you do, if you didn't want to take the vessel apart, you decide what might be quicker is to actually take the engine apart within the vessel and try and rebuild it. There are certain large things which can't be moved in and out that way, but you can do a fairly interesting job of rebuilding quite a large chunk of the engines that way on some vessels. Then we have hull life. So usually at this point, when I put this picture up, and I think this is HMS Monmouth, people look at it and go, well, yeah, there's rust, that's the obvious. No, it's not the rust. It's not the scarred paintwork. Honestly, that's not the problem. What the problem with hull life is, have a look at that hull and really look at it. Really look at it. And if you look at next to the F, it looks like it's concaving in a bit, doesn't it? And that's not a trick of the light. If you go along, you can actually make out... You can literally make out the ribbing of the hull. You can literally make out where there are the bulkheads, especially the sort of the transverse ones. And how can you see this? Well, because the pressure of operating the North Sea and North Atlantic, those thick waves, and the fact that Type 23s were built to be the light frigate, and Type 22 was supposed to be the long service frigate, so the light frigates, and there were supposed to be more of them than just the 16 which were actually built, well, they had a lighter hull. They weren't supposed to be the long-lasting ships. They were supposed to be just, ships you'd be replacing. So actually, part of the rebuild of the Type 23s, and one of the things which affected which ships have been having the rebuild, is fitting them with thicker steel plating, but also, can the hull, is it in good enough condition, has it survived well enough to take the thicker steel plating? So some ships which look like good ships, they've always had a good crew, they've always worked, they've always been reliable ships, and they've always been great. So you look at the cost of repairing them, of refitting them and putting them into service, and you suddenly go, oh, that's not viable. Because of the hull. Because that ship has been a good ship, it's always been available, so it's been out in the North Sea, it's been out in the North Atlantic a lot. And the hull was not designed with a long life in mind. It wasn't. Hull, engines. These are your core things. Your core big systems. Systems which are in there are an issue. Systems which are on the top in the superstructure and sort of the upper part of the hull, they're fairly easy to deal with usually as a rule. They're usually the lighter things. The heavier things are down below. And this brings us on to the next thing, upgradability. Well, I've put in basically Standflex for the Danish, just as similar as the simple path on this, and you've got the fact that the British are buying the Type 31, which is based on the Danish frigates. They're good frigates. The Eva Hurtfeld class. They're good vessels. They really are, as are the Ausland class, but for different reasons. And the difference is the British have not gone with a Standflex system. The British are building the Type 31s as these general purpose light frigates. And they haven't made a decision to go with a Standflex system. Which is actually going to mean upgradability is going to be more difficult. But there are reasons for it, because once you start in on the Standflex system, well, once you start down that road, it's very, very difficult to get out of that road. If you want to. And theoretically, built-in systems are better. They are lighter. They do allow you to carry more missiles. They have lots of advantages. But Standflex are these modules which are very easy to upgrade, because you take them off the ship, you stick them in a factory, or you build them in a factory, and then when the ship comes into harbour, it goes into dry dock, crane comes along, plop in, plop out. Software update, yeah, we've got new systems. No structural work required. So, there are fors and against on these things. You can also make the case, Mark 41 VLS, the standards, one of the core VLS systems, and probably the most commonly in service amongst Western nations. Well, that's probably a good line for upgrade, because if you use that, then there are going to be lots of other people using it. But also, the thing is, it's expensive. And you then might not want to go with some of the missile systems which are already included in that. You might want to go with other systems. And the trouble is, on the level of upgradability, also comes in a lot of different companies these days in the defence market, and their various appointments to proprietary information. Sorry, mosquito. And that is a problem. Proprietary information does have an impact on upgradability. So you have ease, you have cost. Ease can be a ship thing, i.e. can the ship actually take the being upgraded? I.e. the actual hull, the actual air engineering. What are you going to need to do to support that upgrade? Do you need to have increased the what's called the hotel load, the standing load of power, etc., that is required for operating the ship? Do you therefore need to include a space for more power generation? More fuel to keep that going and maintain your a similar range? What are your requirements going to be? Upgrading a ship, which is a system of systems, and it is very much a system of systems. I did laugh recently because I saw a newspaper article which said that a class of ferries were more complicated to build than a class of warships. I don't think so. You can make a case for some of the big cruise liners, the really massive cruise liners. They are certainly more complicated than some warships. There is an overlapping because of the systems and the various things they have to have on them. But I don't think ferries. I don't think, especially not those ferries. If anyone wants to look up the Scottish ferries. There's complicated things there, but they're not quite as complicated as these. And that brings us into the next question: suitability, not just of upgrades, but suitability of the vessel to the tasking. I.e., HMS Victory does not make a very good escort for the Queen Elizabeth class aircraft carriers. As pretty as she is, she ain't as useful as a Type 45 for that role. It also gives you a nice picture. This picture gives you a nice idea of the scale of things we're talking about. Ships have grown up massively in size. And the reason they've grown up in size, especially in recent generations, is because we expect individual hulls to do a lot more. And this is a problem with upgrading older hulls, because what's in there is what's in there. And if you want to do more missions or different missions, you might not have the space to add that stuff in. So that means you have to take things out, which means you can't do the missions that the equipment you took out used to allow you to do. So, for example, the conversion to general purpose frigates for the Type 23s, because some of them stayed as ASW frigates, some of them were converted into GP frigates for distant stations, like HMS Montrose. They lost their towed array sonar. They lost a lot of other things as well. Why? To make space and weight available for what they need to do their mission. Their new mission, their general purpose, their forward deployment mission, carrying the supplies, the necessary tools and systems. People often point out to larger ships and go, well, if it's large enough, surely that doesn't matter. Well, it does. It still has an impact. Just because you're a bigger ship does not mean you're any less crammed. The Type 45s are excellent vessels. And yes, they were built with space to have a Mark 41 VLS added in, which is now going to be a C-Scepter system being added in instead. So they're losing what's become their forward gym space. But that space was literally built in from the beginning. That's not because they have space which was free. That space was built in from the beginning to take a Mark 41 VLS strategic length cells. If you hadn't built that space in, it wouldn't have any room for an upgrade, or for that stuff to be added in, without a lot more being taken out than a secondary gym. And gyms are important spaces on ships. Again, why? Because you need to keep the crew fit and healthy. And because if you look at most modern warships, because there's a need to reduce radar returns, etc., they no longer have the ability to run around the ship. You could do that on a Type 23. If we go back to this earlier picture, you can see you can run all the way round a Type 23. You can't run round a Type 45. You still need to keep your crew healthy and fit. So a gym has to become necessary. Now, you can go, well, oh, hang on, no, it may be a gym. Why do we need the, perhaps they can just all run around the helicopter flight deck. Well, you can have them running around the flight deck, and that was part of the Type 23. But then, whenever you need to operate your helicopters, that flight deck is going to be used for that. And everything else you plan on using that flight deck for suddenly has to factor into your crew fitness. And crew fitness is a big thing about keeping a crew healthy and alert and viable for their duties. And also, let's be honest, exercise is a very useful method of managing stress. And mental health, especially when you're dealing with longer and longer deployments because of fewer hulls to cover the duties, management of stress becomes another thing you have to think about in designing your ship and upgrading your older ships. Crew requirements. One of the biggest changes that's happened with navies since the 1920s, that started, I would argue, with the Treble class destroyers in the Royal Navy, but in every navy has their own sort of beginning point, and then it's not really copying off each other. It's convergent engineering in many ways. It's usually the example I give of convergent engineering. I know others give the example of propellers, and some give examples of various cars. I use crew accommodation, the crew requirements. You start to have the things that a crew needs starts to get more of them. And for many years, even post World War II, the standard was a 40-person mess. Where you'd have a space which was literally one relaxing area for 40. And they have often a great rapport, and many of the crew who experienced them look back on their times in such messes with fondness. But that isn't the standard today. It's usually a far smaller mess, so people have far more space. One of the reasons for that is these people are often highly skilled, highly trained, highly motivated individuals who, if they want to get a job in the civilian market, can often find work. So you need to give them a slightly better quality of life to keep them in. Because, believe it or not, patriotism, that's a core thing of why they join. But no privacy, no ability to relax, and a uncomfortable bed on a 9-month tour of duty at sea, that'll be a reason you'll lose them. And you don't want to lose them when you spend all the money training them. You don't. It doesn't make any sense and doesn't help you. So again, this is another factor in terms of ship life, because can you upgrade the messing facilities? Can you upgrade the facilities for crew? And then you've got the manning requirements of the ship in the first place. This often comes up when I talk about designs, but I will often hear people turn around and go, well, the US Naval and Navy aircraft carriers are the best in the world. Yeah, they are. But no other Navy would have procured them. Maybe the Chinese might be, but I doubt it. Why? Because of their crew requirements. If we consider a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier will have roughly 5,000 to 5,200 crew. The Royal Navy in its entirety, including reserves, this is including reserves, maxes out at roughly 36,000. So you would be putting 1/7 of the entire Royal Navy, including reserves and Royal Marines, everything, in terms of the Royal Naval Service, into each ship to crew it. That's not sustainable. It's not viable. There is a reason, therefore, that, well, the crew requirements for the Queen Elizabeth class are up to 1,600, including the aircraft element and troop berths, but it's 679 crew normally. If we consider, compared to their predecessors, the much smaller Invincible class, well, they had a ship's company of 650 and 350 air crew. So the Invincible class displaced 22,000 tons. The Queen Elizabeth class displaced roughly 65,000 tons. And the crew requirements have gone up by 29 for the ship's company. It's not going to break the Royal Navy's back to operate it, personnel-wise. And that's still going to be an effort, but it's within the Royal Navy's needs. And also the Royal Navy has dropped from roughly 4 carrier-sized vessels, the HMS Ocean, Invincible, Illustrious and Ark Royal, to 2. I don't agree with that. I don't consider it sensible. But that doesn't matter. There are factors here going on in terms of personnel retention and in terms of crew. So that is something else you have to think about. And also you have to think about if you upgrade, especially if you're adding systems in, you're maintaining all the existing systems, that's going to be extra crew you're going to need to accommodate. So all these are factors in deciding whether it's better to terminate a class, build a new one, or to upgrade it. But in the end of the day, it comes down to budget. At the end of the day, budget is always going to be your biggest factor. And whether or not your government of the day, at a time when you're making a decision, thinks there is actually a necessity for it or not. Whether they consider a navy to be just something that's showing the flag and looking pretty, or a job creation project for the shipyards, or whether they consider the navy to be something vital to national security, and national security something they actually have to worry about. Those are factors. Anyway, I hope you found this interesting and I hope you found it useful. I normally end these videos with a question, but I think today's topic is enough that I don't need to. But also I want to leave the question for the discursive one, which I'm going to record next, which will be Wednesday's videos. I don't know. It's fun times. But what have we got coming up? Next week we have from unrotated projectiles to hypersonic missiles. That's going to be a fun one. Week after that we have 21st century sea power, reimagining Corvette and Cable. That one could be currently recorded. I might go to re-record that. And then building the fleets of Tsushima is coming up. Someone recently asked me to do my sort of view on the Battle of Tsushima. Well, that's probably going to come up in that video. And 20th of November, why no more battleships? And then we're definitely into the Christmas period. And the Christmas videos. It's going to be fun. But they start a little bit before then. And I haven't updated this slide with the patrons coming up, but there are some good patron videos coming up, and I hope you're going to enjoy them. Thank you very much for watching. Take care, and hope you enjoyed the video. Ba-dum-bum-bum.